So I'll tell you what I was thinking about as I walked in. I was thinking this world is becoming more unrecognizable to us each day. We're like strangers in our own world. You know, when I moved to South Africa 10 years ago, in October, it's going to be exactly 10 years. When I moved to this country, for a long time, it just took me a while to start feeling somewhat familiar with this place and not feel like a visitor. Because for a very long time, you're a visitor. Truth is, in certain areas, I'm still a visitor. I still don't get local sports. I still don't get local politics. Not that anybody does, but I don't get it. Like obviously certain nuances and humorisms and everything, and Afrikaans. There's certain parts of the culture I'll never understand because I wasn't born here. My kids will. I don't. But you feel like a foreigner in a place that's unfamiliar. Like it's just not your natural habitat. It's like taking an animal and plucking them out of the wild and putting them in the zoo. It's not natural. And for many of us, this past 4 months feels like that. We're taken out of our natural habitat, which is the world that we seemed to know. And now we're in a world that we have no idea. And that's a very strange feeling. You feel like a stranger in your own world, the same world that you understood. Think about it, there are people, whether they're born autistic or on other spectrums, that struggle with social cues, etc. But most people, majority of people, pick up social cues. What does that mean? You pick up social cues. It's you figure out the ways to navigate this world. And children who are born without those skills, we try to give them those skills so that they're able to find their own way to navigate this world. But a lot of the skills that we have, whether naturally or taught, on how to navigate the world are no longer here, are no longer applicable. Doesn't mean that they won't be applicable in 2 years or 3 years' time, but currently, a lot of what makes our world run feels absolutely foreign. Like, when was the last time you had an awkward social moment? 4 months ago, because when was the last time you had a social moment, period? When was the last time you had a simcha to go to, a social evening? When was the last time you had to go to an appointment and it was just normal? When was the last time you could just hug your friend? When was the last time you went out of the house? And suddenly it feels like you're a foreigner, like you walked into a new country, a new planet, a new universe where everything runs differently. Like if you compare the world you lived in last year in July to this year in July, you're like on two different planets. Handshaking is evil. Hugging is absolutely an abomination. Everybody's so firm that not only don't they hug the other gender, they don't hug their own gender. Everybody is hermits living alone at home. Holidays are like few and far between. If this distrust of medicine is bigger than ever because people feel like nobody knows anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like the world that you lived in and the world that you're living in are two different planets, and you feel like a foreigner. And what my topic of my shir today is, like, I want to focus on that feeling, to embrace that question. What does it feel to feel like a foreigner? Because in the Torah, it tells us once to love your fellow as yourself, and it talks over 30 times of treating the foreigner as an equal. Because what is a foreigner? Whether it's somebody that converts into Judaism, whether it's somebody who moves from a different culture, a foreigner by definition is a misfit. They don't have the same story as everybody else. That's why they're foreign. I don't have the same background. I don't have the same story. So when you walk into a Haredi shul, everybody black hats, long shaitels, and the whole thing, you're feeling like a foreigner because you're not part of that story. Everybody else in that room has bought into a story, and you're not even sure what that story is. And you feel like, 1 second, like, I don't know anybody. I don't understand what's going on over here. And that's the way most of us feel if we immigrate, even if we went to study abroad for a year, whatever it is, you go into a space that's not your natural safety space, and it's very awkward. That feeling is a very important feeling to acknowledge, because it's that feeling that teaches us true empathy. Because for those of us who maybe have never had that feeling as a foreigner, that feeling of not belonging, that you cannot make sense of what's going on, for those of us who have that struggle, right now is a great classroom on what it feels to be different, on what it feels to walk around and feel like you have no way of navigating this world. It's a great way of understanding a child who's on the spectrum and just doesn't get social cues. It's just like, it's not natural for them. They don't understand certain things. They don't understand how to navigate this world. It's very much like that in many ways for all of us right now. We're like, how do you navigate this world? Like, I had a way of interacting. I knew how to greet people, and I knew how to keep social relationships, and I knew how to have a holiday, and I knew how to shop. You figured out the mechanisms of the world. So once in a while, the world threw you a blow, a death, a grief, violence, etc. But on the most part, 23 hours of 24 hours on an average day, you knew how to work this world. You know how to live it. And now most of us are like, how do you live in this era? What are you supposed to do? Like, how do you keep your mental health in this era? So people will tell you exercise in your garden. Fine. Again, but nobody knows. Nobody knows what's the best way to survive Corona in the best way possible, because we're living an experiment and we don't have any results. And what we thought we knew, like 2 weeks ago, everybody thought that once you had COVID, you've developed an immune system and you have a herd immunity. Now, research just came out that they checked in England, people 3 months after they had COVID, and their antibodies have weakened, and pretty much a speculation is that they could get it again. So pretty much you got it once and now you could get it again. So this whole idea of herd immunity doesn't exist. Okay, so whatever we try to make sense of, a week later we find out that you can't make sense of it, which is a very unusual feeling. I want you to acknowledge that, because until now, once you figured out, like this, there's some kids in class that are socially talented. They just figure out and they become the queen or the king of the class. They just figure out how to maneuver. Other kids struggle, but eventually, unless the kid has a disability, most people will figure out how to navigate the world structures. And those who don't consider themselves misfits. But now we're all misfits. How does it feel? And I think it's an incredible opportunity to develop empathy, because when they say don't judge anybody till you stand in their shoes, well, now we're standing in their shoes. Now we're standing in the shoes of people who look at this world and don't know what is right and what is left, what's proper, what's improper, how to navigate. And that feeling of empathy can give us so much compassion for other people. Like, often people will say, I don't understand why this group of people can't break themselves out of poverty, and I can't understand why this group of people are so stuck in the past, and I don't understand why this, etc., etc. And suddenly you realize that all you need to do is put you in a different scenario, and pretty much we're all lost. As Jews, we come from an incredible culture, and our culture is that we've managed to build ourselves up after lots of struggles many times. So it's within our DNA that we build ourselves up. But let's be honest, we don't have it within our DNA how to deal with a virus. Like, we're as lost as anybody else. And for that moment, you actually start feeling what it means to be uncertain, to live with lack of clarity. Because if you would ask me what's the biggest challenge of Corona, it's a world with no clarity. Nothing is for sure. There's no definites about anything. When the world will open up, when we'll be able to hug each other again, when we'll be able to interact, what's the long-term effects of this illness, What's the short-term effects of this illness? What's it going to do? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just questions and questions and questions and questions. So we're living with almost no clarity on the road forward. Now, truth is, in hindsight, 2019, we also didn't have clarity because nobody could have predicted this. But still, but at the moment, you felt like, yeah, okay, it makes sense. Like 2019, I'm going to focus on these goals. In 2020, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to take a trip to Peru, and we're going to settle certain financial issues, and we're going to do investments, whatever your plans were. You had a sense, and now you're like, well, 1 second, I have no idea about anything. Embrace that feeling, because in that feeling, you're entering the world of millions of people who live like that every day, even without Corona, struggling to figure out how to navigate this world, struggling to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And maybe, just maybe, that was one of the goals that God had in mind when he gave Corona. Again, for the millionth time, declaration, I don't claim to talk on behalf of God. But think about it, the world before Corona was a world that was becoming more and more isolationist, more and more othering. Politics was becoming much more radical. The Brexit, the Trump, the Europe, the whole universe, the local politics over here, very extreme. And a lack of empathy for other people. Struggling to understand how people see this world. A lot of judgment. And maybe, just maybe, one of the lessons God's trying to teach us, and by putting us all into the same universe, is to actually develop empathy. We're all human beings and we're all struggling right now. We all are clueless. Whether you're a multi-billionaire or you're living on the street, you're as clueless. The billionaire has no more security of this virus than we do. I mean, I know great people in the community who haven't walked out of the house for 4 months who've been infected. So you could be the world's biggest politician and be the biggest billionaire, and the virus can come hit you like anyone else. There's no protection for it. And that vulnerability is suddenly equalizing all of us. Corona, the great equalizer. That's what it is. It's equalizing. All our money, all our status have no power in this time. I mean, I just saw there was a story like sailors who were on sea for over 30 days somehow got infected with Corona. But the question is, like, they haven't been with any people for 30 days. So how did they suddenly show the symptoms? We just don't know this illness. We just don't. And that uncertainty is humbling. And humbling and humility is where unity comes. We can only appreciate one another as human beings when we're humble, when we realize that we're all on the same boat, that we're all clueless, that we don't know anything. See, certainty is a curse. What do I mean? Hitler was certain that the Jews are the problem. EFF is certain that the whites are the problem. ANC is certain that the opposition is the problem. You're certain that anti-Semites are the problem. Everyone's certain about stuff. And that's how my certainty clashes with your certainty, and we stop getting along. Human beings, when they get certain, they make really stupid things. My religion's right, not your religion's wrong. Let's let the Protestants kill the Catholics kill the Protestants, because we're both living with certainty. A bit of uncertainty is very humbling and very grounding. And in that grounding process, it makes us better people. We walk out of this COVID, whenever it's going to be, and if we're willing to listen to some of its lessons, we won't be so judgmental of others. We'll be able to understand the fear of a family that lives in poverty and doesn't know what's next going to happen. We can now understand that, because we also lived with uncertainty and we panicked. We can understand civilizations that feel frozen and they don't know how to break out of generations of abuse. And like suddenly you start realizing how scary the world is when you don't know how to navigate it, and how important it is to then educate people with skills to navigate this world. Like, I try to think back to myself. I was a kid that naturally didn't necessarily figure out social dynamics amazingly well. Maybe that's why today I spend my whole day analyzing them. But those days I didn't. And like, I remember that feeling of like this unfamiliarity with the world. Like, this world is so scary. And there was an episode that happened. One time we went to a store, as a family. And we walked out of the store and one of my siblings got left in the store. 30 seconds. We walked out of the store, 30 seconds later, we noticed, oh my gosh, she's not here. We ran back. I entered a manic mode. I literally panicked. And for the next few years, I remember living with absolute terror. How scary it is. I remember asking God, please put me to sleep. I was 9 or 10. Put me to sleep for the next 10 years that I wake up as an adult. Because as a child, I'm struggling to navigate this world. I'm struggling to make sense of this world. I'm struggling to live in this world. God, thank God, didn't listen to my prayers. But I remember that terrible feeling of living in a world where you just like, it's so scary. That's the world we're living in now, where we don't know. And the only being who knows is not telling, and that's God. God knows, and he's not saying a thing. And it's very humbling. It's very humbling. Like, I was talking to Chaya a few minutes ago, just before I started to share. We were talking about the mikveh and the building that we built. I had taken, when the shul went ahead on the project to go build the building, I had committed that I'm going to work my heart out to keep that building occupied. And for the few months I had, we did a great job. And now my building is dead as dead comes, as are millions of buildings around the world. I had a plan, I had a strategy. As I told the donors, 2019 is the year you build, 2020 is the year that I fill your building with activities. Well, 2020 is when Zoom is making a lot of money, but other than that, the building's not having any activities. I thought I knew how the world works. I really did. I thought with strategies, like I saw today on Facebook, my 5-year plan is to make it through 2020. It's my 5-year plan, just to survive this year. Like, I thought I knew how to navigate this world. I thought I figured out, okay, this is my strategy. I have a plan for the year, but ultimately, plans, great plans, wonderful. And I'm saying embrace that humbling experience, embrace that uncertainty, embrace it, because in that, we become better, more compassionate people. We can now understand other people's grief. We can now understand other cultures. We can now see people through eyes that we never knew. You might never know starvation the way a person in a township knows it, but you know what uncertainty feels like. You know what terror feels like. My gosh, will the illness hit me? Will it hit my mother? What's going to happen? Are we going to survive? You've become familiar with that. And now you can look at them in the eyes, and instead of looking top down, which we often do with people from a lower social class, shame, here's a piece of bread, in my great compassion. No, now you can look at them eye to eye, equals, with dignity, and saying, I maybe don't know what you're going through, but I have now become familiar with that feeling. I remember when my father died, someone told me, I forgot who it was, he said, there's a language of grief that until you taste it, you don't know it. And it's 100% true. Until you've tasted grief in your life, you've never spoken that language. It's like hearing Chinese. Now, even though I could take a translator and translate on Google from Chinese to English, I never understand the language. Once you've tasted grief, once your shirt was ripped, then you become familiar with a whole different language. And it's the same thing now. Once we've tasted uncertainty, we've entered a new language that our generation never really tasted. Our parents' generation did. whether it was living in Russia, whether it was living in Germany, having to run, whatever, Lithuania, whatever backgrounds your parents came, they lived uncertainty. And we maybe live with the traumas of their uncertainty, but we never tasted that uncertainty this way. A little bit, you know, what will apartheid happen, this and that, but ultimately, in your back of your mind, you knew if all hell breaks loose in this country and it goes to the dogs, you'll get on the plane, you'll make aliyah, whatever, you'll make a plan. This is the first time that the whole world, whether you're living in Israel, which is about to go in lockdown again because they've lost control, whether you're living in Australia, who just canceled all their Qantas flights all the way till March 2021, or whether you're living here, you're in the same boat. Wealthy nations are having the biggest issues. America's is the #1 country in the world, with then Brazil, etc. It's a mess. And now, at least for my lifetime, I'm tasting real uncertainty in a way that I've never tasted it before. I've tasted tragedy. I've never tasted not knowing when something will end. I mean, even when I saw the towers, okay, the towers came down. It was extremely tragic. America got its back on its feet. It started building, and that story just became some impetus. Let's go to war. Let's solve the world's problems. It turned into a mess. But whatever. The point is that it was a once-off event. This is the first time for modern human beings, I believe, and the people who were born in the second half of the 20th century, unless you're living in the Soviet Union, first time for many of us to actually taste a prolonged sense of doubt. What now? What do I do? How do I navigate this world? How do I plan in this world? Do I book a ticket to go somewhere? How do I save money? What's going to happen to the economy? Nothing. Absolute cluelessness. And jobs that seem to be the most stable jobs on the planet, like, you know, having a great position in movies. Well, suddenly movies are struggling because there's no theaters. Or acting in a play on Broadway. Broadway's been shut down for the rest of the year, and actors and actresses are begging for food. And those jobs which seem to have such a lure, or people who run beautiful vacation spots or hotels and are declaring bankruptcy. In other words, you thought you knew like what kind of things make the world tick and what kind of things don't make the world tick. No idea. And in that feeling of foreignhood, in that feeling of what is wrong with my world, we're now finally understanding a very important human experience that our time didn't understand. And maybe that's why politics has gotten so rotten. You see, after the Holocaust, for a while, people realized the terrible price that was paid for dividing, for othering other people. But after 75 years of the Holocaust, people slowly started forgetting the lessons. And suddenly you start seeing anti-Semitism, racism, everything starting to surface on higher numbers. And for me, this is almost God, instead of bringing a world war that gets us to our feet, having something much less dramatic than a world war, but still no less affecting. It affects us in huge ways. To come and say the same, guys, stop. Feel for another person. Don't other the other. Wealthy, don't look down at the poor. Poor, don't look down on the wealthy. You're all in the same boat. I don't care if you have a bunker worth $1 billion that's going to save you from a nuclear bomb. You still can't spare yourself right now from the virus. And that humbling experience where we're all being cut down to size is quite amazing to watch. To see people who claim to know everything acknowledging we don't know. To see people coming and saying, you know what, I hope God has something in mind, but at least people are acknowledging that God exists, that somebody's in control, because this world doesn't seem to have anybody in control other than God. Nobody else seems to be controlling it. The scientists don't have answers. The atheists don't have answers. Nobody has answers. Truth is, religion also doesn't have an answer. The only answer that religion has is someone's in control. And that someone is all good and all encompassing and is going to take this world to a better place. But other than that, we don't know anything. And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I suddenly hit me like, this uncertainty is there to teach me something. It's there to teach me compassion. To realize that ultimately we're all equal humans. No matter what race you come from, no matter what gender you come from, no matter what bank account you have, no matter what background you have, you're equally powerless against an invisible enemy that's not even terrorism. For the last 20 years, the world thought that what's ever going to bring the world to its knees, not for the last 20 years, for the last 100 years, we thought if the world's ever going to come to its knees, it's going to come from a nuke. So for 40 years, America was fighting the Soviet Union with the Cold War, and a lot of it was boiling down to nuclear power and who's going to use it against who, the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera, et cetera. Then it was terrorism. Are the extremists going to get their hands on a dirty bomb, et cetera? Spending trillions of dollars fighting terror. And meanwhile, a bat in China is developing some kind of virus, which then goes into some Chinese fellow and then takes the world down to its knees. And we thought we knew how this world runs. And we thought we knew what are safe businesses to invest in and what not. You see those businesses that are closing down one after another in the United States, JCPenney, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much, unless you're a technology business, you're going to the dogs. Who knew? So I say that this time, other than the many lessons that we need to have and reaching out to one another and doing chesed and growing our education and using this time as productively as possible, also to embrace those uncomfortable feelings that we're feeling now, to realize that there are people that feel these feelings every day. Whether those who struggle with certain disabilities, whether people who struggle with real fear, people who live in unsafe environments, live with that uncertainty, women who live in neighborhoods that are very violent towards women, et cetera, whatever it is, the world's people live in that uncertainty. And to develop compassion. Like when I go on Facebook, I'll be honest, I see the least compassionate place on the planet. I just see anger. I see tremendous anger and people posting family pictures and everyone telling them they're cute. But that's as much as compassion goes. But to really feel, not everybody screaming, this one screams white lives matter, this one screams black lives matter, and both of them are not listening to each other. The white's not listening to the black's not listening to the white, the Jew's not listening to the non-Jew, the non-Jew's not listening to the Jew. Everybody just look at each other as humanity. Look at each other with dignity. Look at each other with just humility. You don't know any more than the other person. And you have no more rights than the other person. We're all created in the image of God and we're all deserving of dignity and love. And that pop star you thought so cool, well, she hasn't had a concert in 6 months. So what you thought was cool and what you thought was your dream job, really? Embrace the present. Embrace the present and realize that in this moment of absolute uncertainty and darkness, that's why earlier today I read from my grandfather's book, Deep in the Russian Night, because I'm more and more, even though I'll never experience what he experienced, I'm getting familiar with that feeling. Just like grief, I can never understand somebody else's grief, especially if their tragedy was much worse than mine. But at least I could talk the same language. I maybe won't use the same words, but I have the same language. I finally feel like I'm developing a language that I could understand what my grandfather felt day in and day out, panicked from the communists or from the Nazis. Obviously, it's different, but feelings are feelings, and that familiar uncertainty, what is going to happen? What's happening to my world? Will it ever be okay? That feeling is unfortunately becoming familiar. But in that unfortunate familiarity is becoming the experience for true compassion and empathy. See, because a year ago, my gardener thought that his life was messed up and my life was privileged. And now he and I are both realizing we're not that different after all. He maybe earns much less than I do every month. And I might be living in a nicer house than his. But in the face of this virus, whether you're living in a hut in Zimbabwe or you're living in a nice house in the northern suburbs, same story. That invisible monster could come in through any door. And in that humility, there's unity. Egos don't allow for unity because you and I are egos that clash. And you take away from my space and I take away from your space. But when we're both humble, when we both remember that we're simply human beings, I think that creates a better world. And I hope and I pray that in this worldwide experiment that's happening, that we don't only come out healthy, but that we come out wiser. And that some of the stupid directions we were heading the last few years, political directions, religious directions, a world that's so confused that doesn't know what it wants anymore, a world that's so politically correct that nothing is right or wrong. Maybe, just maybe, this will knock us back a little to our senses. We'll realize that the solution to all world's problems is not this, it's not that. It's not if the liberals win or the conservatives win. It's simply the solution to all world's problems is a little more humility and a little more love. Shkoyach, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.